The stench of the trench on you is ruining my imported Italian sofa. You look like a crude mercenary, not a wife. Get out of here tonight and don't humiliate my son in front of his high-class boss. That was the knife my mother-in-law plunged into my pride right before she grabbed my combat duffel bag and hurled it straight into the freezing snow on the front porch. I had just driven hundreds of miles surviving a grueling overseas deployment, holding on to the desperate hope of a rare Christmas leave. I looked at my husband, David. He stood there wearing a tailored designer suit paid for entirely by my military hazard pay. He didn't flinch. He just tilted his chin and delivered the final blow. This Christmas party has no room for you. Go find some cheap hotel to sleep in. They threw me out of the very house with my name on the deed. I turned my back on them and walked into the blizzard without shedding a single tear. But before I tell you how that freezing night became the exact moment I shattered their fake, high-class empire, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and keep watching. Because what happened on the local news just hours later destroyed my husband's entire life. I stepped through the expensive oak doors of my home that evening, bringing with me the heavy silence of a soldier returning from a grueling, sweat-soaked deployment. There was no fanfare, no welcome banner. An active-duty U.S. Army major rarely broadcasts her return from high-stress combat zones. 22 years of service had taught me never to expect a parade. But I expected at least a nod. At least the basic human acknowledgement that the woman who had been sleeping in body armor for 6 straight months had finally made it home, alive. Instead, I found my husband David and my mother-in-law Martha staring at me with cold, calculating disgust, as if a stray animal had wandered through the front door. Martha sat perched on the imported Italian leather sofa, a piece of furniture I paid for in cash using my combat hazard pay 3 years ago. She sipped her tea with her pinky finger, extended a habit she had copied from a magazine she found in the dentist's waiting room, and her eyes locked onto my dusty uniform as if I were carrying a disease into her sterile little kingdom. The heavy, suffocating scent of her expensive perfume filled the entire living room, thick enough to choke on. The sharp squeak of the Italian leather groaned under her weight every time she shifted, and her lip curled upward with every creak of my boots on the hardwood floor. I tightened my grip on my duffel bag straps, locking my posture into the rigid stance of a commanding officer. My back was straight enough to use as a leveling tool. I refused to show the exhaustion buried deep in my bones. I had been traveling for 31 hours through 2 connecting flights and a 4-hour drive from the nearest base. My uniform still smelled like dust and diesel and the chemical residue of the portable laundry unit at my forward operating base. I had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days. David refused to meet my eyes. He stood by the mantelpiece, adjusting the cuffs of a shirt I bought him during my last leave. He smoothed the front of his designer blazer, a garment that cost more than what most enlisted soldiers earned in a week, paid for by an automatic transfer from my military account that I had set up during our first year of marriage and never had the heart to cancel. He finally spoke, his voice slick with corporate anxiety, his jaw tight. My boss, Arthur Vance, and his wife are coming to dinner tonight. He's a strict veteran, real upper class. His presence determines my vice president's seat. I absorbed the information. I set my heavy boots firmly on the hardwood floor and kept my face entirely neutral. I had spent the last 6 months coordinating supply chains across hostile territory for 300 soldiers under fire. I had managed food distribution for an entire battalion during a 48-hour lockdown when the supply convoy was ambushed. Cooking a dinner for 4 civilians was a Sunday morning drill. I offered a simple, practical solution the same way I would offer a tactical recommendation during a briefing. I will prepare the food. The room went dead silent. Martha slammed her teacup down on the porcelain saucer so hard the handle cracked. A thin line ran through the white ceramic like a hairline fracture in bone. She stood up, smoothing out her expensive dress with aggressive sweeping motions, her eyes narrowing into slits. She stepped into my personal space, close enough for me to count the veins bulging in her neck, close enough for her perfume to burn the inside of my nostrils. No, this party is not for you. I will play the hostess. My son's career requires sophistication, not a dry, rigid wife who only knows how to talk about guns and discipline. I did not blink. I cataloged the attack the way I cataloged incoming fire source trajectory intent. Martha had spent the last 2 decades living off my military checks. The house she was standing in, the silk robe she wore every morning, the luxury sedan she drove to her country club lunches, the weekly flower arrangements she ordered for the foyer, the membership dues for the tennis club. She never actually played. And all of it was funded by my combat deployments. Every cent she spent on her manicures and her fake high society luncheons came directly from my hazard pay routed through David's account, so she could pretend her son was the breadwinner. And now she was telling me I was not sophisticated enough to sit at my own dinner table in my own house on the one night I had been given leave to be home. David finally looked at me. He stepped forward, and for one fraction of a second, I thought I saw a flicker of something human behind his eyes. Maybe shame. Maybe the ghost of the man I married when I was 20 years old. The nervous civilian who had cried at our wedding and promised me he would always be my home. That flicker vanished. He smoothed his tie and delivered the fatal strike to our 22-year marriage with the casual precision of a man canceling a dinner reservation. It is best that you are not home. No one will know what to talk to you about. The atmosphere will be very awkward. Just one night, Angela. I will pay for a hotel. I stared at the man whose luxury car was parked in the driveway, funded entirely by my decades of freezing night marches and bleeding on foreign soil. To him, my existence was merely an awkwardness, a logistical problem to be removed before the important guests arrived, like a piece of furniture that clashed with the decor. I looked at the Christmas tree in the corner of the living room. I had wired the money for every ornament on it from a military base 6,000 miles away. The star on top was something I had picked out online during a rare 15-minute break between convoy briefings, squinting at my phone screen in a sandbagged bunker while mortar fire thumped in the distance. I had imagined David placing it on the tree and thinking of me. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum. An officer is trained never to waste ammunition on worthless targets. When the enemy is standing inside your own living room, wearing your money on their backs, eating food your paycheck bought you, do not engage in a firefight. You execute a tactical retreat. You gather intelligence. You wait for the right moment to strike. I watched Martha grab my heavy canvas duffel bag with both hands, her manicured nails digging into the rough fabric, and shove it out the front door onto the icy porch. The bag hit the frozen wood with a dull, heavy thud. 22 years of marriage packed into one bag, thrown out like garbage. I turned on my heel, stepping out into the biting winter wind. The cold hit my face like an open hand. I did not shed a single tear as the heavy oak door slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed across the empty street. I drove until I found a cheap, crumbling motel hidden behind Highway 75. The neon sign out front was missing 3 letters flickering in the wind like a dying heartbeat. The parking lot was half empty, littered with rusted pickup trucks and a vending machine with a smashed front panel. The harsh scent of moldy carpets and cheap bleach punched me in the lungs the moment I pushed open the door to room 14. I dropped my duffel bag onto a mattress that violently creaked under the weight springs, groaning like a wounded animal. Operating on pure unconscious military habit, I immediately checked the deadbolt, tested the chain lock, secured the window latch, and inspected the perimeter of the room in a clockwise sweep. The walls were stained with something brown near the ceiling. The bathroom faucet dripped in a steady, maddening rhythm, each drop hitting the porcelain basin with a tiny, sharp ping. The carpet near the door was a different shade than the carpet near the bed, as if someone had tried to scrub something out and failed. Compared to sleeping on the shaking steel floor of a C-130 military transport plane, sandwiched between ammunition crates and 30 snoring soldiers with rifles across their chests, this room was technically a luxury. But physically, I was fine. It was the pride in my chest that was bleeding out. No combat manual ever written, no field regulation, no leadership doctrine in the entire United States Army teaches a soldier how to survive being stripped of their own home by parasites wearing designer clothes bought with her blood. A few hours later, my phone lit up on the cracked bedside table. The screen cast a pale blue glow across the water-stained ceiling. It was a text from David. I stared at the screen, reading the words that confirmed his absolute cowardice. "Hope you settled in. Thanks for understanding." I gripped the edge of the phone until my knuckles turned white. Understanding. It was a vicious, cruel word. He mistook the dead tactical silence of a military officer for the submission of a weak victim. He thought my quiet departure meant I agreed. He thought I had accepted my role as the invisible cash machine, the human ATM, that funded his empire, but was too ugly, too rough, too military to sit at his table and eat the food her own paycheck bought. I could have typed a paragraph destroying his ego. I could have reminded him that the roof over his head, the imported wine in his cellar, the cashmere sweater on his back, and the investment portfolio he bragged about to his colleagues all came from a woman who had spent 6 months eating sand, sleeping on steel, and dodging mortar rounds so that other people's families could sleep safely. I could have told him that every automatic deposit he relied on came from a woman who had once crawled on her belly through razor wire during a base security breach while he was getting his nails buffed at a day spa with his mother. I could have reminded him that the word understanding was something I showed when I missed our 15th wedding anniversary because my unit was deployed to a hot zone with 72 hours notice, and he spent that evening at a jazz club with Martha, using my credit card to buy a bottle of champagne that cost more than my weekly combat rations. Instead, I used my thumb to punch in exactly 2 words. I'm fine. Soldiers do not complain. We absorb the pain and forge it into armor. We swallow it, compress it, and store it in the same locked compartment where we store every other wound we have ever received in the line of duty. The difference is that shrapnel wounds heal. The medics pull out the metal, stitch the skin, and the body repairs itself. Family wounds just keep bleeding. As the afternoon faded into darkness, hunger set in like a dull blade pressing against my stomach. I walked to the corner convenience store and bought a dry, pre-packaged turkey sandwich. The plastic wrap crinkled as I peeled it open. The bread was stale, the turkey was the color of old newspaper, and a single wilted lettuce leaf clung to the side like an afterthought. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, forcing the tasteless food down my throat, swallowing the bitter reality of my marriage along with it. The last time I'd eaten something this miserable was 3 years ago, on a freezing night in a forward operating base in a country I'm not allowed to name. I was sharing a box of stale crackers with Sergeant Lena Torres. We sat back to back, our rifles across our laps, watching the perimeter through the green haze of night vision goggles. Torres had split her last packet of peanut butter with me without being asked. She did not owe me anything. We were not blood. We had no shared last name, no family obligation, no holiday tradition. But she gave me half of everything she had because that is what soldiers do. That night, surrounded by strangers who would have taken a bullet for me, I felt more at home than I had in 22 years of marriage to the man whose text sat glowing on my phone. Across the motel room, the ancient television flickered to life on its own, showing bright, overly cheerful holiday movies filled with laughing families gathered around enormous turkeys and perfectly wrapped gifts. Fake snow drifted across the screen. Fake smiles beamed from every face. The noise of the television felt like shrapnel in my brain. I stood up, walked across the stained carpet, and violently ripped the power cord out of the wall. The plug came out with a sharp snap. Silence flooded the room again. I sat back down on the bed, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting on my knees, my eyes locked on the peeling wallpaper. I refused to let their betrayal break my discipline. The motel room smelled like bleach and failure, but it was mine. Nobody in this room was telling me I was too crude to exist. By early evening, the temperature outside had plummeted well below freezing. I looked down at the 2 small gift bags sitting on the motel dresser. Inside the first was a heavy steel watch for David, a field-grade tactical piece I had custom-ordered from a military exchange catalog during my deployment. I had spent 3 weeks choosing the right one, comparing models during my rare breaks, imagining his face when he opened it. Inside the second was a pure silk scarf for Martha, hand-selected from a market overseas, the fabric so fine it slipped through my fingers like water when I first held it. Both gifts had traveled 6,000 miles in my duffel bag, wrapped carefully between my body armor and my spare boots. I had carried them through checkpoints and customs, protecting them from damage the way I protected everything I loved with excessive foolish care. I made the tactical decision to execute one final march back to the place I used to call home. I did not go back to cause a scene or throw a tantrum. An officer does not engage in loud, messy theatrics. I went to drop the items off as a physical ritual, a permanent severing of my ties to their world. I wanted to leave the gifts on the porch and walk away from every dollar, every sacrifice, and every ounce of misplaced loyalty I had poured into that house for 22 years. I parked 2 blocks away and moved through the shadows, keeping my footsteps light on the packed ice. The crunch of my boots on the frozen ground was the only sound on the empty street. The air was so cold it burned the inside of my nostrils with every breath. I crouched beside the frozen bushes near the front porch, my eyes tracking the bright yellow light spilling from the living room window. Through the glass, I saw the perfect corporate charade. David stood by the fireplace, wearing a ridiculously expensive cashmere sweater, holding a glass of red wine, laughing brightly at his boss, Arthur Vance. Arthur was a tall, silver-haired man with the rigid posture of a career military officer, broad shoulders, and hands that had clearly done more than shuffle papers. His wife, Helen, sat on the couch with her ankles crossed, polite and observant. Beside David, Martha arched her back proudly, showing off a string of pearls around her neck. Pearls I had purchased with my very first officer's paycheck 20 years ago. I had been a brand new second lieutenant, 22 years old, and I had walked into a jewelry store in uniform and spent every dollar of my first real paycheck on those pearls, because David told me his mother had always wanted a set. Martha paraded around the living room, touching Arthur's wife on the arm, laughing too loudly, playing the high-class aristocrat with rehearsed precision. The house was spotless gleaming and entirely devoid of the crude mercenary who paid the mortgage. I watched this scene for a full minute, cataloging every detail with the cold precision of a surveillance officer. David refilled Arthur's wine glass with the obsequious smile of a man performing for his supper. Martha laughed at something Helen said, throwing her head back in an exaggerated gesture I had never seen her perform in private. In private, Martha was a bitter, sharp-tongued woman who ate dinner in silence and only spoke to criticize the temperature of her soup or the brand of butter I had purchased. This laughing, charming hostess was a character she had invented for the evening, as fake as the designer labels she had sewn into a coat she bought at a discount outlet. I stepped onto the porch with silent, measured steps. I placed the gift bags right next to the welcome mat, positioning them carefully so they would be visible when the door opened. I left no note. There was nothing left to say to people who had already said everything they felt about me. As I turned around, the muffled sound of their hollow, pretentious laughter echoed through the frosted glass. It did not break me. Instead, that laughter acted as a furnace, melting down the last pathetic ounces of hope in my chest and forging them into cold, impenetrable steel. Something permanent closed inside me. A door sealed with rivets. I turned my back on the house, pulling my collar up against the biting wind, and walked away. My boots crunched through the packed ice. I did not look back, not once. I returned to the suffocating silence of the motel room. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, feeling the strange, hollow relief of a woman who had just amputated a dead limb. The phantom pain was there, throbbing somewhere deep behind my ribs. But the infection was gone. The hope was gone. And without hope, there was no more vulnerability. I was clean. I was cauterized. Shortly after, my phone erupted with a piercing emergency tone that jolted me to my feet. It was the local volunteer network. The Northern Winter Shelter's main water pipe had burst, and dozens of homeless families were facing an immediate freezing crisis. An American soldier never ignores a call for help. Protecting the vulnerable is hardwired into my spine. I grabbed my keys, bolted out the door, and fired up my truck, pointing the headlights straight toward the community center. I kicked open the double doors to the community shelter and stepped right into pure chaos. The massive overhead pipe had cracked wide open, spraying freezing water across the main hall in violent arcs that hit the far wall. Children were crying in the corners, their tiny hands clutching soaked blankets. Elderly men and women huddled against the far wall, shivering so hard their teeth sounded like rattling bones. Cots were completely flooded, personal belongings floating in 3 inches of icy water, shoes and paperback books, and family photographs drifting across the floor. The civilian volunteers were running around in circles, screaming at each other, paralyzed by panic. Nobody was in charge. Nobody had a plan. 2 women were arguing about whether to call the fire department or a plumber. A man in a reflective vest was filming the flooding on his phone instead of helping. My brain instantly flipped a switch. The military logistics training I'd honed over 2 decades activated immediately. This was not a plumbing emergency. This was a field crisis with vulnerable civilians, exactly the kind of operation I had run dozens of times in combat zones. I did not ask for permission to take charge. Permission is a luxury reserved for peacetime. I stepped into the center of the room and projected my voice from my diaphragm, cutting through the noise like a blade. I established a temporary chain of command on the spot. I pointed at two frantic teenagers near the supply closet and ordered them to gather all dry blankets into the back corridor. Now no questions. I grabbed a heavy pipe wrench from a panicked janitor who was standing in ankle-deep water staring at the ceiling with his mouth open and marched straight into the flooding utility room to shut off the main valve. The freezing water sprayed directly into my face as I cranked the valve with both hands. My fingers went numb. The valve groaned, resisted, and finally locked into place with a metallic screech. Within 10 minutes, I had stopped the flooding. I moved through the crowd with mechanical efficiency, assessing injuries and assigning tasks. I patched up a bleeding scrape on an old man's arm using the first aid kit from my truck. His name was Harold. He was 83 years old, a Korean War veteran who still wore his discharge pin on his coat collar. He had been sleeping at the shelter for 6 weeks after his landlord sold the building out from under him. As I cleaned the cut on his forearm with an alcohol swab, he looked at my hands at the way I wrapped the gauze with practiced clinical speed. He squinted at me and nodded slowly. "You served," he said quietly. It was not a question. I finished tying off the bandage and squeezed his bony shoulder. "Yes, sir." He grabbed my wrist with a grip that was still surprisingly strong. "Then, the ones who need you the most never say thank you. But the ones who find you, we never forget." I handed out thermal rations, organized the remaining families into safe, dry sectors in the back half of the building, and directed the teenagers to set up a rotation for monitoring the elderly through the night. For the next few hours, I operated like a relentless machine. The physical labor was exhausting, but it stitched up the bleeding wounds in my chest. Here among the broken and the freezing, I was a pillar of strength. Strangers looked at me with deep gratitude, thanking me simply for being there, for giving orders, for knowing what to do when nobody else did. The brutal contrast echoed in my head like a drill sergeant's cadence. At the shelter, I was a savior. At my own dinner table, I was trash. I pushed the thought away and focused entirely on the mission. Once the shelter was fully stabilized, the water cleared, and the industrial heaters running at maximum capacity, I stood by the exit. My muscles burned with fatigue. Every joint in my body ached. My uniform was soaked from the waist down. I pulled a thick red wool scarf tightly around my neck, zipped up my tactical jacket, and walked out into the freezing night toward my truck. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the ignition. The engine coughed twice before catching. I pulled onto the road, my headlights cutting through the darkness. I had no idea that the ultimate test of my discipline was waiting for me just a few miles down the icy asphalt. I drove down Route 18, the river running parallel to the black road on my left. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the pitch-black night. Suddenly, every survival instinct in my body fired at once. My eyes caught violent, jagged skid marks tearing through the packed snow on the shoulder, leading straight to a shattered metal guardrail. The twisted metal was bent outward, still vibrating slightly, the brake fresh. I slammed the brakes. My truck fishtailed on the ice and skidded to a stop. Down below in the pitch-black freezing river, the nose of a heavy SUV was buried in the ice at a steep angle, slowly sinking into the dark water. The rear tires were still spinning, throwing up plumes of dirty slush. The headlights beneath the surface cast an eerie greenish glow through the black water. I did not freeze. I grabbed my tactical flashlight from the glove compartment, kicked my door open, and sprinted down the steep embankment. My boots slid on the frozen mud. I dialed 911 on the run, barking the exact coordinates with zero hesitation. An SUV went into the river. Route 18, north coordinates. 4 people trapped. Requesting heavy rescue and divers. Immediately, I reached the riverbank just as a young man in a pickup truck slammed on his brakes on the road above me. He slid down the icy hill on his backside, his face drained of color, his eyes wide and white with terror. Inside the sinking SUV, the father was violently punching the driver's side window with his bare fist, blood smearing the glass with every hit. The mother in the passenger seat was screaming, clutching two children against her chest. A boy, maybe 7, a girl, maybe 10. The freezing water was already pouring through the cracks around the doors, rising past the floor mats, climbing up the seats. The young man from the pickup truck reached my side, his entire body shaking so hard he could barely stand. He stammered through chattering teeth, "Oh God, what do we do?" I turned to him, channeling the absolute authority of a battlefield commander. I locked my eyes onto his and crushed his panic instantly with a single order. "Listen to my command, get the glass breaker now." He scrambled back toward his truck on all fours, pulling a steel tire iron from the bed, but his hands shook so violently, he dropped it twice, climbing back down the bank. He reached me holding the iron bar out like a man handing over a live grenade. The SUV shifted violently, with a sickening metallic groan, sinking deeper as the ice beneath it cracked and buckled. The mother screamed again, the sound cutting through the night like a siren. "Give it to me." I snatched the heavy steel iron from his trembling hands. I rapidly wrapped my thick red wool scarf around my left hand, pulling it tight, creating a protective pad against the glass. I calculated the structural weakness of the window in a fraction of a second. The bottom corner. Always the bottom corner. I swung the steel bar with bone-crushing force, my entire core rotating into the strike, burying the tip right into the weakest point. The window exploded outward in a shower of jagged shards. Sub-zero river water blasted directly into my face. The cold hit me like a concrete wall. My lungs seized. My vision went white for half a second. The shock nearly drove me backward. Ignoring the jagged shards of glass slicing deep into my knuckles, I shoved my upper body through the shattered window into the sinking metal tomb and grabbed the 7-year-old boy by his collar. He was limp, gasping, his lips already turning blue. I hauled him out through the window and shoved him up the bank into the young man's shaking arms. I reached back through the window for the 10-year-old girl, but she clung to the back seat with both hands, her fingernails digging into the wet leather, her body rigid with terror. "I won't leave my mom," she screamed, her voice cracking and raw. The freezing water was up to my chest. My spine went numb from the waist down. My fingers were losing sensation fast. Using every ounce of my muscle strength, I violently ripped the jammed safety latch out of its housing with my bare hands, the metal cutting a deep gash across my palm, and pushed the girl up the bank to safety. She grabbed the frozen grass and pulled herself up, sobbing. The vehicle gave way with a sickening metallic groan, plunging downward, the rear end lifting out of the water before sliding deeper. The mother was trapped in the front seat, her seatbelt locked tight, cutting into her chest. She was crying hysterically, her hands clawing at the buckle. I grabbed her heavy winter coat by the collar, planted my boots on the sinking door frame, and roared over the sound of the cracking ice. "Use your leg strength to push with me. Do not give up." I executed a violent, desperate pull, the muscles in my shoulders, screaming, my boots slipping on the icy metal. The seatbelt strained, then snapped with a sharp crack. I dragged her up onto the snowbank, just as the SUV vanished into the black water, forever swallowed whole by the river, with a deep final gurgle. The surface closed over it like a mouth shutting. Gone. Minutes later, the sirens screamed across the bridge. Red and blue lights painted the snow in alternating flashes. I stood quietly in the background, my clothes frozen solid to my body, blood dripping from my knuckles into the white snow, creating small red craters. The paramedics wrapped the family in thermal blankets. The father grabbed his children and wept into their hair, his body shaking with sobs. A local news reporter, Chloe Jenkins, sprinted toward me with a cameraman trailing behind her. The camera light hit my face harsh and blinding, and I squinted but did not look away. "What made you jump in there while others just watched?" she asked, breathless, shoving her microphone toward my face. I stared straight into the camera lens, my voice perfectly calm, my breath pluming in the freezing air. Blood was running down my wrist and dripping off my fingertips. That is instinct. I only did the duty of a normal human being. Have you ever watched someone who humiliated you suddenly get exposed by their own lies? If you believe that karma always catches up to toxic family members, hit the like button and share your experience in the comments. The way my husband's boss reacted to the news broadcast is a lesson they will never forget. Arthur Vance told me everything that happened in my dining room that night. every detail, every word. He recounted it with the precision of a man delivering an after-action report, and I believed every syllable because Arthur Vance was not the kind of man who embellished. He told me the story weeks later, sitting across from me in a quiet diner, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, his jaw tight with the controlled fury of a man who had witnessed something unforgivable. They were serving an expensive dessert when it happened. Martha had arranged the imported chocolate pastries on porcelain plates in a perfect semicircle, fanning them out with the precision of a woman performing the only role she had ever rehearsed. She poured coffee into hand-painted cups she'd ordered from a catalog using my credit card. The flat-screen television in the living room was humming quietly in the background, tuned to a local channel that nobody was watching. Suddenly, the screen flashed red with a breaking news alert. The broadcast cut to shaky cell phone footage recorded by the young man on the bridge. It showed a woman in a tactical jacket, her hand wrapped in a red scarf, violently and precisely dismantling the window of a sinking SUV in a frozen river. The footage was raw, chaotic, and brutal. The sheer speed and efficiency of the rescue played out on screen in real time, the camera shaking as the young man struggled to hold his phone steady. The room went quiet. Martha's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, a piece of chocolate pastry dangling from the tines. Arthur Vance, a man who had spent a decade commanding troops in combat zones before climbing the corporate ladder, leaned forward in his chair. His sharp eyes immediately recognized the combat discipline, the economy of movement, the zero-hesitation decision-making. The way the woman on screen assessed the vehicle's structural integrity in a fraction of a second before striking the glass at the exact point of maximum weakness. He pointed at the screen, his voice filled with deep, unmistakable respect. My God, look at her movements, the calmness, the structural assessment, the decisive force. Only officers forged in life and death can execute that so perfectly. Martha sat back in her chair, rolling her eyes in disgust at the television screen. She scoffed loudly, entirely missing the context, entirely blind to the catastrophe forming around her like a noose tightening around her own neck. She waved her hand dismissively, a smear of chocolate on her lip. Oh, please, Mr. Arthur is praising her too much. What do those crude people know besides brute force? She has no classy feminine aura at all. Arthur's wife Helen froze with her wine glass halfway to her lips. She stared at Martha with the slow dawning horror of a woman who had just heard something deeply, permanently wrong. At that exact second, the camera on the television cut to a close-up of my frozen, bleeding face. The reporter asked the question. I delivered my answer, my voice flat and calm, my breath visible in the freezing air. The entire dining room froze in a state of absolute horrifying paralysis. Crash! The expensive crystal wine glass slipped through David's fingers and shattered violently against the hardwood floor. Red wine splattered across the white rug like arterial spray. His face drained of all blood, turning the color of a floating corpse. Martha's jaw dropped open, her hand flying up to clutch the pearl necklace I bought her, as if the jewels were suddenly strangling her throat. Her pastry fell onto the white tablecloth, leaving a brown stain. Arthur Vance stopped moving. His veteran instincts locked onto the terrified silence in the room. His eyes darted from the bleeding woman on the television screen to the sweating, trembling coward sitting across from him. The strategic puzzle pieces snapped together in his mind with brutal mechanical speed. David's clumsy excuses earlier in the evening, something about his wife being still on active duty and unable to get leave. The missing wife. Martha's bitter comments about a crude person. The expensive house, the designer clothes on a man whose salary Arthur knew to the penny, the military hazard pay funding, all of it. Arthur stood up slowly, and according to him, the temperature in the room dropped to absolute zero. He straightened his jacket with the deliberate precision of a man preparing to deliver a court-martial verdict. He stared down at David and asked a question that sounded like a loaded gun being cocked. David, is that Angela? The wife you claimed was on active duty and couldn't come home. David sat in his chair, stuttering, unable to form a single coherent word. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from the water and thrown on a dock. Seeing her son's corporate dreams collapsing in real time, Martha jumped up from the table, knocking her chair backward, waving her hands in a frantic, desperate panic. She tried to deploy her usual gaslighting, her voice climbing to a shrill, pleading pitch that cracked on every other syllable. Sir, it's a misunderstanding. That girl has a weird personality. She isn't fit to sit at a table with people like us. She didn't even get to finish her sentence. Arthur Vance slammed his massive hand down on the dining table so hard every piece of silverware jumped. A dessert fork clattered to the floor. The porcelain cups rattled in their saucers. The thud echoed through the house like a mortar round hitting packed earth. "Shut your mouth!" he roared, unleashing the terrifying authority of a former general. His face turning a deep, burning red, the veins in his neck standing out like cables. The room went dead. Martha stumbled backward, her hip catching the edge of her overturned chair. David pressed himself into the back of his seat, as if trying to disappear through the upholstery, his fingers gripping the armrest until his knuckles went bone white. Arthur pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at David's face. His voice dropped from a roar to something far worse, a low grinding fury that sounded like a tank engine idling before it rolls over everything in its path. A military officer just risked her life to save 4 people. And you parasites standing in her house, wearing clothes bought with her money, called her crude and threw her into the snow. Your existence makes me sick. He leaned over the table, his massive frame casting a shadow over David's shrinking body. His eyes burned with absolute disgust. He held the stare for 5 full seconds, letting the silence crush whatever remained of David's spine. Then he turned to his wife, grabbing his coat from the back of the chair with one swift motion. "Let's go, Helen. I will not breathe the same air as these ungrateful parasites for 1 more second." Helen Vance stood without a word, her face tight with controlled fury. She placed her napkin on the table with deliberate precision, looked Martha directly in the eyes, and shook her head slowly, once the way a mother shakes her head at a child who has done something beyond redemption. The front door slammed shut behind them, echoing like a gunshot through the empty house. The sound of Arthur's car starting in the driveway cut through the silence, followed by the crunch of tires on frozen gravel, and then nothing. Just the hum of the television showing replays of my frozen, bleeding face. Hours later, as I sat in the hospital emergency room, having the glass shards pulled from my knuckles one by one, my phone vibrated on the metal tray beside me. The nurse paused her tweezers, gripping a sliver of automotive glass embedded deep near my index finger. I glanced at the screen. It was David. I accepted the call with my free hand pressing the phone to my ear, listening to his heavy, frantic breathing. "Angela," he sobbed, his voice cracking with sheer terror. Not grief, not guilt. Terror. The terror of a man watching his career, his reputation, and his carefully constructed lie collapse around him like a condemned building. "I am 1,000 times sorry. Please do not tell the media what we did tonight." He was crying, begging for his public image, pleading for the preservation of his fake empire, entirely ignoring the fact that I had just survived a freezing river and was sitting in a hospital with blood-soaked bandages on both hands. He did not ask if I was hurt. He did not ask about the children I had pulled from the water. He asked me to protect his lie. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults. I stepped out of the hospital room, the IV line tugging slightly at my wrist, and isolated myself in the quiet hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me. The linoleum floor was cold under my bare feet. I spoke to him with the chilling, dead-eyed precision of a sniper pulling the trigger on a target that had stopped moving. "You chose your battlefield, David. Now die on it." I ended the call. I tapped the screen, blocking his number permanently. I turned off the phone and walked back into the hospital room. I sat down in the chair and extended my hand to the nurse. She looked at me with wide eyes but said nothing. She picked up her tweezers and went back to work, pulling the glass out of my knuckles. I did not flinch. The next morning, I sat across from Chloe Jenkins, the reporter, in a quiet coffee shop 2 miles from the hospital. I wore a plain sweater. My bandaged hand rested on the table beside a cup of black coffee I had not touched. I did not cry for the cameras. I did not perform grief. I answered her questions with the blunt, immovable posture of a soldier sitting in a debriefing. "What were you supposed to be doing last night after your long deployment?" she asked softly, her recorder sitting between us on the table. I looked out the window at the frozen lake across the street. The ice was thick and white, completely still. I was supposed to be in my own house, but my husband and his mother needed it to entertain his boss. The presence of a soldier like me was considered an inconvenience, a stain on their upper-class facade. Chloe paused, her pen hovering over her notepad. Her jaw tightened. She looked down at my bandaged hands and then back at my face. Was that a mutual agreement? I looked back at her. My voice did not waver. No. She wrote for a long time after that single word. I did not elaborate. I did not need to. The article dropped that afternoon. Chloe did not publish David or Martha's exact names, but her pen was a razor-sharp bayonet. She wrote about the resilience of a real-life military officer and the cruelty of family members who operated as financial leeches, draining a soldier's combat pay to build a fake high-society persona while discarding the very person who earned it. She described the rescue in visceral detail and let the contrast speak for itself. A woman who saves strangers from a frozen river thrown out of her own home on Christmas Eve by the people living off her paycheck. The internet exploded. A massive wave of public fury zeroed in on the ungrateful parasites. The story was shared tens of thousands of times within hours. Veterans groups picked it up. Military spouse forums amplified it. Local news stations across 3 states ran follow-up segments. Martha panicked. She barricaded herself inside the house I paid for, drew the curtains on every window, and frantically created fake social media accounts under false names, trying to spread rumors that I was a violent, irresponsible wife who had abandoned her family due to mental instability. She posted fabricated stories about my erratic behavior and claimed David had been the real provider all along. The internet sleuths, fueled by the collective fury of thousands of veterans and military families, tracked her IP address in hours. They dragged her real identity into the light, exposing her completely, posting public records of the house deed. In my name, the car registration in my name, the investment accounts funded by military direct deposits that had been routed through David's personal checking account for 2 decades. They found the luxury purchases, the country club memberships, the spa receipts, all time-stamped during my deployments, all funded by my hazard pay. Her fake high society friends, the women she had brunched with every Tuesday, blocked her number, one by one. They did not defend her. They did not call to check on her. They simply vanished the way people always vanish when the person they were using for status becomes a liability. The country clubs refused her entry. The florist who delivered her weekly arrangements canceled her standing order. Her wall of vanity, built brick by brick over 22 years using money she never earned, collapsed into dust. Arthur Vance told me what happened at the corporate headquarters a few days later during one of our quiet conversations at the diner that had become our regular meeting place. He described the scene with the same clinical detachment he used when recounting combat operations, but I could hear the disgust underneath every word. David had dragged his feet into the building that morning. The article had already circulated through every department. Someone had printed it out and pinned it to the break room bulletin board. Every employee he passed in the hallway stared at him with open contempt. The receptionist, who usually greeted him with a cheerful smile, looked down at her keyboard and said nothing. The colleagues who used to shake his hand in the elevator turned their backs. The aggressive clicking of keyboards fell silent as he walked past the open plan desks, and the silence followed him like a funeral procession. When he reached his office on the executive floor, Arthur was already sitting behind David's desk, his reading glasses perched on his nose, a thick stack of financial audit documents spread across the glass surface. Arthur tossed the documents toward David. The pages landed with a heavy final thud. "Do you know what impressed my wife the most about Angela?" Arthur asked, his voice dead flat, his hands folded in front of him. "It wasn't the physical strength. It was the fact that she didn't shed a single tear to beg for pity. She kept the absolute pride of a soldier." David kept his head bowed, sweat pouring down his face, dripping onto his pressed shirt. He tried to salvage the wreckage. "Sir, my family had some internal misunderstandings." Arthur cut him off, tapping the financial documents with his index finger, producing a sharp, rhythmic sound like a judge's gavel. "I had the accounting department run a background check. The Lexus you drive, the suits you wear, the investment fund you brag about, every single dime was transferred from your wife's military hazard pay. You built your ego on a woman's blood, and then you cowardly hid her away." Arthur stood up, towering over David, who seemed to shrink to half his size in the leather chair. "You are stripped of your nomination. Starting today, you are demoted to the lowest level employee until you submit your resignation. Get out of my office." David stood up on legs that barely held him. He gathered nothing from the desk. No family photos, no personal items, because everything on that desk, like everything in his life, belonged to someone else. He walked out of the office past the row of silent employees who watched him shuffle toward the elevator. The heavy thud of the corporate file hitting the glass desk echoed behind him like a final verdict. The elevator doors closed around him, and the humiliated silence swallowed him whole. I moved in with my younger sister, Emma. Her house was small, warm, and honest. There were no Italian leather sofas, no imported pastries, no designer suits hanging in the closet. There was a squeaky screen door, a kitchen that smelled like strong coffee every morning, and a spare bedroom with a quilt her grandmother had sewn by hand 30 years ago. It was the first place in 22 years where I did not feel like I owed someone for the privilege of existing under their roof. A month later, I was standing outside the community shelter, reinforcing the roof of the parking port with a heavy canvas tarp. The rough texture of the material scraped against my calloused palms. I pulled the thick ropes taut, tying them off with military precision, testing each knot twice. The smell of pine needles drifted from the tree line behind the building. The air was cold but clean, carrying nothing but the scent of honest wood and frozen earth. David appeared at the edge of the parking lot. He looked like a decaying ghost. He had aged 10 years in 4 weeks. There was no designer suit, no luxury car. He wore a wrinkled jacket with a stain near the collar and shoes that had not been polished in weeks. He stood near the entrance, hunching his shoulders like a prisoner waiting for his execution date. His hands hung at his sides, empty and useless. I kept working, pulling the ropes, ignoring his presence entirely, until he finally stepped forward into my line of sight. His shadow fell across the tarp. "I sold everything." David croaked, his voice raspy and broken. "I bought a one-way ticket and sent my mother back to the countryside. She is never allowed to step foot in our lives again. All the money, I refunded it to your account." I slowly wiped my grease-stained hands on a rag. I looked at him with eyes devoid of any emotion. No hatred, no pity, no love. Nothing. Just the flat clinical assessment of a soldier evaluating a threat that had already been neutralized. "For what?" I asked coldly. "To buy back your peace of mind." He looked at his shoes. His hands hung limp at his sides like dead weight. "No. My therapist said my pride was a cancer. I'm giving the house back to you. I will start over with empty hands, and I will wait for you for the rest of my life." I stared at the man I had married, the man I had sent every paycheck to for 2 decades, the man who had worn my blood money like a costume and discarded me like a prop that had served its purpose. I felt no hatred, but I also felt absolutely zero love. All that remained was an impenetrable, freezing boundary. A wall I had built with my own bleeding hands, reinforced with every insult, every dismissal, every night I had spent sleeping on steel floors, dreaming of a home that never wanted me back. "You destroyed your own base, David," I told him, tossing the rag into a toolbox with a heavy clang. "I never returned to a place where I was abandoned. Good luck on your own battlefield." I turned my back on him, grabbed a wrench from the workbench, and walked back into the shelter without looking back. He stood in the parking lot for a long time. I know because Harold, sitting by the window inside, told me later that David stayed for nearly an hour, standing in the same spot, his arms hanging at his sides, staring at the door I'd walked through. Then he turned around and walked away. His shoulders hunched, his feet dragging through the gravel. I never spoke to him again. I never answered another call, another text, another letter. He sent 7 letters over the next 3 months. I returned every single one unopened. Time moved forward. The weeks bled into months. I filed the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning, signed them at a metal desk in a county clerk's office, and drove home to Emma's house, listening to the radio. There was no ceremony, no drama, just ink on paper and a chapter permanently closed. On Christmas Eve the following year, I stood in the warm, bright living room of Emma's house. The shelter I had volunteered at had become my extended family. Harold, the old Korean War veteran, sat in the armchair by the fireplace, telling a rambling story about a sergeant he once knew who could fix any engine with a paperclip and a prayer. The family I had pulled from the freezing river was there. The father stood by the window, his 2 children chasing each other around the Christmas tree, laughing so hard they kept tripping over the presents. He caught my eye across the room and nodded once slow and deep. No words were needed. The 7-year-old boy was wearing a red scarf. Arthur Vance and his wife Helen stood by the kitchen counter, raising a glass of warm cider in my direction. Arthur had become a quiet, steady presence in my life, not as a boss, not as a superior officer, but as a man who understood what it meant to serve and to be thrown away by civilians who would never comprehend the cost. Emma walked up behind me and placed a gentle hand on the shoulder of my dress uniform. I had ironed it that morning, pressing every crease with the same discipline I had carried for 22 years. Emma smiled softly, her eyes bright with tears. She was too proud to let fall and said the only words that mattered. "Welcome home, Major." I smiled back, a real smile. Not the tight, controlled expression I wore like a mask for 2 decades, but something that started deep in my chest and spread across my face before I could stop it. I finally dropped my armor, every plate of it, every shield, every wall. I had learned the hardest lesson of all. Home is not a piece of real estate occupied by parasites. Home is where your sacrifices are honored and where your presence is their greatest pride. Sometimes the hardest campaign a soldier fights is not on a fiery battlefield thousands of miles away. It is the long, silent march of retreating from the people who wounded you, crossing the frozen ground alone, and building something new on the other side with your own bleeding hands surrounded by the people who chose to stand beside you. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic marriage to finally find your true worth? If my journey of cutting off the parasites and finding a real family inspired you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment below and share how you rebuilt your life after betrayal.